The modern world is diverse and encouraging diversity. Probably the mainstream, the most important philosophy that unites different peoples nowadays is the philosophy of diversity. Diversity is presented as probably the most important modern virtue. People are encouraged to comprehend, to cherish, to cultivate their diversity, their difference from other people and groups. Probably never before humanity realized its diversity so well, so clearly as it does nowadays. At the same time, the world is global and globalizing and being globalized. Globalization is another important feature that we understand about this world clearly, and we understand this feature as defining the modern civilization. It does not mean, though, that globalization is something new. It happened in the past, and I would argue that globalization is a non-stop process. It comes in waves, but those waves never fade away. They just continue, they grow, they become bigger, and the wave of globalization that we face nowadays is probably the tallest one in comparison with other waves. It does not mean, though, that the waves of globalization in the past were less important or had a different nature. No, it was the same kind of globalization. Somehow diversity and globalization are connected because in the globalized world we realize much better our diversity. We can see on a larger scale how differences exist and interact with one another now on the global scale. In the past, people saw and observed those differences locally. Now we can see them globally, and we are really astonished by the fact how different we are. The globalized differentiation, as it were, is conditioned by the modern systems of education, by modern media, including social media. It certainly has its setbacks, like people complain about being engaged in social bubbles, and those bubbles, or to put it in a different way, a more philosophical way, microcosms within which we live. They don't communicate with other microcosms. Sometimes we project our small bubbles, our small microcosms to the entire world, to the cosmos, and get really confused and sometimes frustrated when we realize that the other people live in different microcosms and they have different ideas, different outlooks, worldviews, and so forth. The global diversity nowadays is conditioned by different philosophical schools, religions, and so forth. In a sense, the modern globalization and the modern diversity is not much different from the globalizations and diversities that the people in the past experienced, including the period of Antiquity. The Greco-Roman Antiquity presents one of the finest examples of globalization. This globalization was framed by two major forces: the Greek paideia, educational system, the way of thinking, and the Roman statehood, the Roman Republic and later Empire, which expanded throughout the entire universe. Virgil, in his Aeneid, famously said that Rome is an empire without end, and indeed, the idea behind the Roman Empire was that it is limitless. Uh, the boundaries that it had at the moment were temporarily, there were frontiers, expanding, ever expanding frontiers, and eventually the Roman Empire was to cover the entire inhabited world, or ecumene. In a sense, it did cover the entire ecumene, not maybe necessarily always politically, but at least culturally, and indeed the Greek culture, the Greek language, philosophy framed the people's minds even beyond the Roman Empire. Um, the peoples within the Greco-Roman world experience the same kind of diversity, a similar diversity that we experience nowadays. That diversity was framed also by different religions, by different philosophical schools, but by different ways of life. People, just like nowadays, we all speak English, but this is like a lingua franca of our time, but we also speak our own languages. In the Greco-Roman world, people did the same. They used the Greek or Latin languages as a universal means of communication with one another, yet they spoke their own languages like Syriac, Ethiopian, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Sogdian, Persian, and so forth. So people really were multilingual at the time. People also lived in their own bubbles, and they were complaining about living in their bubbles. Those bubbles, though, were not formed by social media as nowadays, but mostly by philosophical and religious schools and sects. So the world in the period of antiquity was as global and as diverse as it is now. Moreover, I would say that antiquity actually enjoyed its diversity and encouraged people to preserve its diversity. It was not as homogenizing as, for instance, the Middle Ages would become. And that is probably one of the most important differences between the period of antiquity and the Middle Ages. Even though this difference is completely imagined, that's how we perceive that timeline. But people who actually followed the timeline, who lived in those periods of time, they didn't perceive themselves as living, in antiquity or Middle Ages, or they didn't feel any difference, any bump when they crossed, from the late antiquity, from antiquity to Middle Ages. But there are some differences that indeed make those two periods different, and one of them is the attitude to diversity. The antiquity really, I believe, enjoyed diversity, appreciated and cherished it. The Middle Ages not so much so, and the Middle Ages tended to be more uniformed and more homogenizing. Speaking about the factors that contributed to this appreciation of diversity and to the diversity per se in the period of antiquity, we could identify several of them. One of them was language. All languages, both Greek and Latin, they were used often interchangeably, and educated people could speak both of them. Then it was certainly architecture and visual culture. Like, for instance, one of the most amazing, probably one of the most unifying form of culture in the period of antiquity was mosaic. And you can go to the British Islands, or you could go to Syria, and you find the same patterns of mosaic, the same techniques, the same pictures and topics and styles of putting images, of putting those pieces of mosaics together into images. This was really a unifying, overarching way of stitching the pieces of the diverse ancient world together. Another important instrument of harmonization of globality and diversity in the world of antiquity was a particular side of philosophy that I'm going to explore in the series of our lectures. This is not philosophy per se, because the world of antiquity had several philosophical schools and trends, and they were usually incompatible with one another. They were quite different and competing, arguing sometimes fiercely with one another. At the same time, they had a bottom line, and I'm going to explore this bottom line of various philosophical schools in the period of antiquity. And I would argue that this bottom line also constituted the foundation of this unified, of this consistent world of antiquity. And this frame existed for centuries, until essentially modernity, and only in the period of modernity we changed the platform, the unifying platform, as it were. We moved from the one which had been produced in the period of antiquity to another one which has been produced by the Enlightenment, in the framework of the Enlightenment. Even the Middle Ages stood firmly on that platform. And this is the platform of the logical categories.